The air inside the concrete shaft of the Stalingrad grain elevator did not taste like air. It tasted of scorched wheat flour, sulfur, and the cold metallic tang of raw iron. High above us, in the shadows of the upper silo towers, another German artillery salvo slammed into the reinforced roof, sending an avalanche of white grain dust cascading down through the elevator chutes. I pressed my face into my wool collar and listened to the structure groan under 50 tons of impact. Back home in Saratov, before they handed me a Mosin Nagant and a pair of worn boots, I spent 3 winters working the grain elevators along the Volga River. I knew the sound a concrete chute makes when it settles under load, and I knew how fine grain dust could hang in the air like gunpowder. But the silos in Saratov were filled with golden wheat waiting for barge shipping, not 18 isolated guardsmen holding a concrete tower against a German force that seemed endless. I reached into my trousers pocket with stiff, calloused fingers and squeezed my brass grain sampling probe. It was a narrow, hollow tube of polished brass with a sharp tip, the tool I had used for 2 years to draw sample kernels from deep inside storage bins to check for rot. The cold metal bit through my thin cotton glove, grounding me in the dark. I was Private Vasily Volkov, 20 years old, holding a concrete tower on the Volga shore. I didn't know it yet, but that moment was only the beginning of what Stalingrad would take from us. Those 40 seconds in the silo had been building since dusk, since the concrete walls went red under the fog, and every man in the pit understood what that silence meant. 3 hours earlier, the concussive shockwave of the 14.5mm PTRD-41 anti-tank rifle ripped through the concrete alcove like a physical blow. The blast shattered the stagnant air inside the silo, knocking loose decades of settled wheat dust from the overhead rafters. I pressed my back hard against the reinforced pillar, swallowing down the dry surge of panic in my throat. Scorched grain dust hung in the darkness like a yellow fog, settling heavy on my eyelashes and coating my tongue with the bitter taste of roasted wheat and cordite. Outside the high, narrow embrasure, the autumn wind howled across the Volga, but inside the tower, we breathed the dead air of a furnace. Corporal Boris Orlov leaned his broad shoulder against the concrete embrasure, his dark Sevastopol naval tunic smeared white with flour. He racked the heavy bolt of the anti-tank rifle with a dull metallic sound, sending an oversized brass casing clattering across the floorboards. The 28-year-old sailor popped his knuckles with a dry snap, his eyes fixed on the smoke-choked railway yards below. "That hit his tread," Boris muttered, his voice raspy from swallowing soot. "The bastard is spinning in circles by the grain hoppers." I tightened my grip on my Mosin Nagant rifle, feeling the smooth wood beneath my calloused palms. At 20 years old, I had expected to spend this September along the riverbanks of Saratov, loading bulk wheat into the holds of Volga barges. Instead, my unit, the 35th Guards Rifle Division, was buried alive in 50 meters of Soviet concrete. My right thumb reached instinctively into the lower pocket of my worn khaki tunic. My fingers closed around the cold, polished surface of my brass grain sampling trier. Back at the Saratov elevators, that slender, hollow tool had been my life, used to pierce burlap sacks and check wheat kernels for moisture and rot. Now, it was just a dead piece of home sitting against my ribs. A few paces to my left, Private Pavel Chernov crouched behind a stack of frozen grain sacks. He was 18 years old, a fresh recruit from a farming village upriver, and his hands were already split purple from the damp cold. Pavel shivered uncontrollably, his chin tucked into his lapels as he tapped a small tin matchbox repeatedly against the side of his helmet. "Keep that tin quiet, Pavel," I said. keeping my voice low. The Germans across the tracks don't need a bell to mark where we sit. Pavel stopped his tapping immediately, his wide eyes turning toward me in the gloom. White flour paste clung to his cheeks, making him look more like a baker's boy than a guard's rifleman. He pulled his hands back into his oversized sleeves, shivering hard enough to rattle his belt buckle. "Sorry, Deacon," he whispered, calling me by the nickname the squad had given me when they saw me inspect the flower shoots. My fingers won't stop twitching. It feels like the cold is sitting inside my bones. I didn't answer him, turning back toward my rifle bolt. The heavy firing had jammed coarse wheat dust deep into the receiver slide, mixing with the grease until the action dragged like dried glue. I drew my brass grain trier from my pocket and used its narrow, pointed tip to scrape out the dark sludge from the metal tracks. Working in the grain elevators had taught me how wheat dust behaved when it met moisture. It bound like plaster, hardening inside every crevice it could find. If a rifle bolt seized in the middle of a rush, no amount of pulling would free it before the German grenades came through the window. The concrete walls around us were 3 feet thick, poured to withstand the pressure of thousands of tons of bulk grain, but they vibrated with a continuous tremble from the artillery duels along the Volga banks. Through the arrow-slit embrasures, we could see the shattered expanse of the southern railway station, where burned-out boxcars lay on their sides like giant iron rib cages. In Saratov, during the pre-war autumn harvests, the grain elevators were alive with the sound of conveyor belts, shouting dock workers, and the heavy thrum of river steamships tying up along the wooden piers. Thousands of tons of golden grain passed through those steel hoppers every week, feeding the cities along the Volga. But here in Stalingrad, the grain was trapped inside smoldering bins, and the concrete silos had become a fortress surrounded by war. Boris Orlov shifted his heavy frame, peering through the notch in the wall. The big sailor had fought through the naval batteries of Sevastopol before being assigned to the 92nd Naval Infantry Brigade, and he moved with the rough confidence of a veteran sailor. He cracked his knuckles again, the sound sharp against the thrum of distant shell fire. "They're bringing up another column from the south," Boris said, spitting a mouthful of gray phlegm onto the floor. "I can hear their tracks grinding against the gravel near the timber yard." I leaned my forehead against the cold concrete pillar, closing my eyes for a single second. Through the massive wall, a low, rhythmic thrumming vibrated directly into my skull. It was the low, grinding thrum of Maybach gasoline engines idling behind the railway embankment 200 yards out. The Germans were massing armor along the tracks, warming their engines under cover of the morning smoke. They were waiting for twilight to deepen before pushing their heavy assault guns straight through our thin defensive screen. The grain elevator was a massive monolith of poured concrete and brick, rising high above the southern suburbs of the city. To the German generals, it was an observation post that commanded the entire river sector. To us, it was a giant chimney filled with 3,000 tons of dry grain, waiting for a single spark to turn the darkness into an oven. We had been inside the tower for 48 hours, cut off from the main river crossings and surviving on whatever water remained in our canteens. Every shell impact on the outer walls shook loose a fresh cloud of fine white flour, coating our uniforms until we looked like ghosts haunting a ruined mill. The interior of the building was a maze of narrow catwalks, steel hoppers, and vertical chute pipes that ran 20 stories straight into the earth. Our squad had been pushed back into the central tower on the second evening, after the outer timber yards were overrun by the 71st Infantry Division. We were 18 men, holding 3 floors of concrete, while the Germans occupied the surrounding timber yards and foundation cellars. Pavel leaned closer to me, his breath coming in short, shallow puffs. "Do you think the division will cross the Volga tonight, Deacon?" The corporal said the supply barges were coming over as soon as dark fell. The corporal wasn't looking at the river, I replied, keeping my eyes on the doorway that led to the central stairwell. The German artillery has the bank zeroed to the yard. Nothing larger than a wooden plank is reaching this shore before sunrise. Pavel swallowed hard, his throat making a dry clicking sound. He reached for his canteen at his hip, shaking it close to his ear. A tiny, hollow metallic clink echoed from the tin skin, confirming what we both already knew. There was not a single drop of water left in our section. We had used the last mouthfuls hours ago to wet our gun rags, trying to clear the soot from our eyelids. My tongue felt like a piece of dry leather pressed against the roof of my mouth. Outside, the rumbling of German engines grew steadily louder. The enemy knew we were trapped without food or water, isolated from the 62nd Army's main defensive perimeter further north. They had tried storming the lower doors twice on the previous afternoon, leaving dozens of dead infantrymen sprawled across the loading platforms. But now, they were changing tactics. Suddenly, a strange current of air pulled through the narrow floorboards beneath my boots. It carried a sharp smell of sulfur and scorched oil, rising steadily through the vertical grain chutes from the cellars below. My chest tightened as I recognized that smell from my years in Saratov. When stored grain began to rot in sealed cellars, it produced gases that smelled like sulfur. But this was different. It was mixed with the heavy stench of synthetic German kerosene and motor grease. The German assault troops had reached the lower hoppers beneath the building's foundation. They were preparing to pour oil down the grain pipes and light the bottom of the silo, trapping us in a vertical column of fire. "Boris," I called out softly, stepping away from the pillar. "Do you smell the basement chutes?" The sailor didn't turn his head. He was leaning far over his PTRD-41, squinting through the iron sights as a fresh volley of mortar shells detonated against the upper roof. The impact sent a shudder through the floorboards that nearly knocked Pavel off his feet. "I don't smell anything except dead Germans and burnt bread," Boris growled, his hand resting on the heavy receiver. "Get your squad ready at the hatch, Volkov. If their infantry comes through the timber yard, we'll need your Mosin to keep their head-gatherers off my sightline." I turned back toward the central workbench, where our remaining ammunition sat stacked in wooden crates. The wooden table was covered in a thick layer of wet, pasty dough created by the falling flour dust, mixing with the moisture from our breath and sweat. "Pavel," I said, pointing to the open bolt of the Maxim machine gun resting on the trestle, "take the rag and wipe the feeding tray before the dust sets. If that gun jams when their pioneers storm the doorway, we're done." The young recruit scrambled forward on his knees, his hands trembling violently as he reached for the small piece of clean white cotton rag we had saved from a medical kit. It was the last clean piece of cloth we had in our entire section. Pavel pulled the cloth over the heavy steel tray, trying to work quickly, but his frozen fingers had lost all their feeling in the damp air. As he tried to shift his weight, his knee caught the edge of a rusted water bucket sitting on the floor. The bucket flipped over with a loud metallic scrape. A pool of filthy gray slurry, a mixture of stagnant bilge water, flour dust, and soot, spilled across the floorboards right beneath Pavel's hands. In his panic to catch the bucket, Pavel dropped the clean cotton rag directly into the center of the gray mud. He grabbed for it instantly, but his fingers only mashed the cloth deeper into the sticky slurry, ruining it completely. A hot spike of pure rage flashed through my brain, obliterating 48 hours of stoic discipline. All the fear, the thirst, and the suffocating pressure of the tower compressed into a single instant of uncontrolled panic. I stepped across the workbench in 2 quick strides and grabbed Pavel by the thick wool lapels of his tunic. I yanked him off his knees, slamming his back against the concrete wall with enough force to rattle the breath from his lungs. "You fool!" I screamed directly into his face, my voice cracking with unvented fury. That was the last clean rag we had. How are we supposed to wipe the receivers now? Do you want us all to die because your fingers can't hold a piece of cloth? Pavel stared at me, his eyes wide and glassy with terror. He didn't fight back, nor did he try to pull my hands away from his throat. He just hung there in my grip, his lip trembling as 2 clean lines of tears cut through the white flour paste on his hollow cheeks. "I'm sorry, Deacon," he choked out, his voice tiny against the distant thunder of the guns. "I didn't mean to. My hands wouldn't work." The sight of his terrified, boyish face struck me like a cold bucket of river water. The surge of anger vanished as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a hollow, sickening knot of shame in the pit of my stomach. I was 20 years old, taking out my own fear of death on an 18-year-old kid who had never seen a crop harvested before he was handed a rifle. My hands loosened slowly from his tunic. I stepped back, looking down at his crumpled lapels, and then at the ruined rag sitting in the mud at our feet. Boris Orlov didn't even turn around from his embrasure. In Stalingrad, men screamed at each other every hour, and mercy was a currency nobody could afford to spend. I reached up to my own neck, where my thick gray wool scarf was wrapped tight against the cold. My mother had knitted it for me from coarse Saratov wool before I boarded the troop train at the Volga station. It was soft, clean, and smelled faintly of home, far away from the sulfur and iron of the front. Unwinding the scarf from my throat, I leaned down toward Pavel. He flinched slightly, but I reached out gently, smoothing down his crumpled collar with my thumb. "Hold still," I murmured, my voice flat and quiet. I wrapped the gray scarf twice around Pavel's neck, pulling the soft wool up over his mouth and nose until only his wide brown eyes were visible above the fold. I tucked the ends neatly inside his tunic buttons, patting his shoulder with my hand. "Keep that over your face," I told him quietly. "The dust down here will tear your lungs to pieces before the Germans even reach the stairs. Use the wool edge to wipe your rifle bolt if you have to." Pavel clutched the edge of the scarf with his raw, purple fingers, pulling it tight against his throat. He looked up at me through the gloom, nodding his head twice in silence. No words passed between us, but the air between us felt less heavy than before. I drew a chunk of black rye bread from my side pouch, hard as a stone and saved for an emergency. I used the sharp brass tip of my grain trier to split the crust in two, handing the larger piece to Pavel. We sat together against the concrete pillar, chewing the hard bread in small, careful bites to let our saliva soften the crust. The taste of rye and yeast brought a momentary vision of the vast wheat fields around Saratov, where the Volga flowed wide and peaceful under the summer sun. Back home, September was the harvest month, when the golden wheat was cut and bundled into high shocks, and the air smelled of sweet grain and river mud. In Saratov, my father had owned a small wooden barge that hauled grain sacks up and down the Volga between Kamyshin and the city docks. Every autumn, after the threshing was finished, we would load hundreds of burlap bags packed tight with fresh wheat kernels. I could still remember the sound of the wooden grain chutes sliding over the holds, the rich, nutty fragrance of clean wheat filling the river breeze. Standing in this dark, concrete tomb in Stalingrad, surrounded by the stench of scorched iron and burning oil, those memories of home felt like dreams from another lifetime. I looked at Pavel, chewing his dry crust, with his head resting against the rough concrete wall. He was just a farm boy from a small village upriver, A kid who should have been helping his family harvest oats in the autumn sun instead of crouching behind frozen grain bags, waiting for German mortar shells to collapse the ceiling. "If you ever make it back to Saratov," Pavel whispered, his voice muffled by the gray wool over his face as he chewed the dry crust. "Tell my mother I kept my boots clean. Tell her I didn't cry." "You will tell her yourself, recruit," I answered quietly. "We are going to hold this elevator until the Volga freezes over." The hours dragged on into the afternoon. Heat continued to pulse through the concrete structure as German artillery maintained a steady bombardment of the upper levels. Pavel sat quietly beside the ammunition crates, his hands resting on his knees. The gray wool scarf was still pulled high over his cheeks, filtering out the yellow grit that blew through the doorframe. He had ceased his nervous matchbox tapping, his young eyes focused on the iron sights of his Mosin rifle with a quiet, solemn intensity that belonged to a seasoned veteran. Beside him, Corporal Boris Orlov remained stationed at the primary embrasure, his heavy PTRD-41 balanced on its iron bipod. The sailor's broad back was covered in white flour powder, his dark naval tunic torn at the seams from continuous heavy recoil. Every few minutes, he would lean his ear close to the concrete sill, trying to detect the low vibrations of enemy armor moving through the railway yards below. Boris had served 4 years in the Black Sea Fleet before the war swept him into the 92nd Naval Infantry Brigade. He carried a quiet bitterness in his eyes, the kind of hardened demeanor that men develop when they have seen their home ports destroyed. He watched the railway embankment with an unyielding patience. "They are bringing up 3 separate armor columns," Boris reported, his voice raspy from smoke inhalation. "I can hear the heavy steel treads grinding against the ballast near the freight station. They're preparing for a synchronized assault against the lower loading bays as soon as the sun drops below the horizon." I checked the ammunition clips remaining in my leather belt pouches. We had 4 5-round stripper clips left for my Mosin Nagant, and Boris had only 6 heavy 14.5mm armor-piercing rounds remaining in his canvas bag. If the German pioneers breached the main entrance under armored support, we would be out of ammunition within 10 minutes of continuous firing. Down in the lower basements, the heat began to rise rapidly. The smell of burning oil and scorching grain grew stronger as dark smoke curled through the gaps in the floor. The Germans had ignited the oil in the lower hoppers, turning the bottom of the silo into a raging fire. "The basement is burning," I told Boris, stepping toward the embrasure. "When those lower cellars catch fire completely, this whole tower will fill with flame and smoke. We'll choke up here if we don't hold the stairwell." Boris spat a dark glob of soot onto the floorboards, his jaw set in a hard line. "Let it burn," he growled, racking the heavy bolt of the PTRD-41 with a metallic clatter. "We aren't handing this grain tower to the Wehrmacht while we still have iron in the breach." Outside, the low thrumming of Maybach engines suddenly changed tone, turning into a loud, grinding roar as heavy steel treads bit into the gravel. German Stug 3 assault guns were grinding across the shattered railway tracks, their low-slung hulls spattered with dried mud. They moved in a deliberate semicircle, their short 75mm cannon barrels pointed directly at the lower brickwork of the silo. The siege was closing in completely. We were marooned 50 meters above the ground in a concrete fortress that was rapidly becoming an oven. The first armored salvo struck the base of the elevator with a deafening crack that shook the entire structure from cellar to roof. Tons of brickwork crumbled from the outer walls, filling the courtyard with a thick cloud of gray masonry dust. High above, The concrete chutes vibrated like organ pipes, echoing the impact down through the vertical shafts. Through the narrow window slit, I could see German infantry in steel helmets darting between the ruined boxcars, their submachine guns spraying bursts against our embrasures. The heavy 75mm shells from the assault guns hit the foundation arches, sending shockwaves through the concrete under our feet. "Armor at 500 meters," I shouted. Boris Orlov swung the Pacer D-41 into position, resting the bipod on the concrete ledge, blood trickling from his left ear down his scarred jawline. The 92nd Naval Brigade don't surrender. The heat came through the concrete floor before we ever saw the fire. Down in the basement, liquid fire shot upward through the chute pipes as German pioneers pushed into the hoppers. Thick, yellow smoke surged out of the floor grates, blinding us instantly. The flames spread rapidly through the lower chute pipes. The dry grain stored in the lower bins caught fire, sending a column of sparks cascading through the interior shafts. The air temperature inside our corridor spiked, scorching our skin and making the metal barrels of our weapons painfully hot. We pulled our tunics over our faces, choking on the black smoke that billowed up from the floor grates. Through the smoke, we could hear the German pioneers shouting in German as they pushed through the lower halls, firing their submachine guns into the stairwells. Boris pushed past us into a cramped concrete alcove overlooking the square. The room was built of solid reinforced concrete with a narrow observation slit facing the tracks below. "Boris, don't shoot from inside there," I yelled over the din. "The blast will shatter your ears." He did not hear me. Boris shoved the bipod of the heavy 14.5mm rifle against the concrete sill, cheek pressed to the stock, and pulled the trigger. The room exploded. When the PTRD-41 fired inside that sealed concrete box, the shockwave had nowhere to go. It hit the walls and bounced straight back into our faces with crushing force. My knees buckled, my vision turning completely white. When I raised my head, Boris was lying on his side, blood trickling from both ears onto the dusty floor. He pushed himself up, blinking in a vacant, hollow stare, his ears permanently deafened by the blast. "Hold the chute, boys," Boris shouted, his voice unnaturally loud and flat, the way deaf men speak when they cannot hear their own words. I scrambled across the floorboards to drag Boris away from the narrow embrasure before the German gunners could spot the muzzle flash. The sailor was heavy, his boots scraping against the concrete as I pulled him into the hallway. Before I could pull Boris out of the alcove, a German stick grenade bounced off the outer wall and tumbled into the corridor. It exploded with a sharp, violent burst of spall and hot iron fragments. I threw myself flat against the floorboards, covering my head. Beside me, I heard a wet impact, followed by a soft gasp. When the dust cleared, Pavel was lying against a pile of grain sacks. A jagged piece of shrapnel had torn right through his tunic, embedding itself deep in his upper chest. "Pavel," I scrambled to his side, dropping my rifle. His face had gone chalk white, his fingers clutching the gray wool scarf I had given him, pressing it against his bleeding chest. I tore open my canvas medic pouch for the morphine ampule, but the small glass vial had been crushed into splinters by falling rubble during the blast. There was nothing left to ease his pain except the cold wool in his hands. Pavel looked up at me with a quiet stillness. His fingers tightened on the gray wool scarf, pulling it close to his chin as his breathing grew shallow. His lips moved slowly through the froth of blood. "Tell my mother," he whispered, his voice fading to a dry rasp. He never finished the sentence. His chest fell still, his breath leaving him in a quiet sigh as his head slumped to the side. I sat there in the dark for a long time, holding his cold wrist while the battle raged through the lower floors. The concrete floor beneath us vibrated with continuous explosions, but inside our small corridor, everything was quiet. I remembered how he had shivered when he first arrived in our section, how his fingers had twitched as he tapped his matchbox against his helmet. He had been so young, so unprepared for this war, and yet, in his final moments, he had held onto the wool scarf with a quiet dignity. Then I gently took the wool scarf from his fingers, folded the stained cloth, and placed it inside his steel helmet near the grain chute where flour dust was falling like white snow. I laid his Mosin rifle across his chest, closing his eyes with my thumb. German infantry pushed up the stairwell, boots hammering on the steel treads. MP-40 bursts stitched the concrete walls above our heads, sending chips of plaster flying into the air. We had no more grenades, and our Mosin clips were down to the last few rounds. I grabbed Boris by his belt and pulled him through the rear maintenance passageway toward the secondary exit. The sailor moved slowly, his deafened ears oblivious to the gunfire around us. He kept cracking his knuckles, his vacant eyes staring straight ahead into the smoke-choked hallway. I guided him past the burning elevator shafts, where orange flames flickered through the iron grates. Near a broken grain funnel on the second level, I nearly tripped over a young German soldier from the 71st Infantry Division lying dead under fallen bricks. He could not have been older than 19, his light hair matted with dried blood near the temple. Beside his webbing lay a folded photograph of a wooden windmill near Leipzig, showing a quiet farm under a gray European sky, and in his breast pocket was a small brass token from a Bavarian mill. I looked at his quiet face, then back at the photograph in my hand. He was just a young boy who had lived near a mill in Germany, far away from the Volga. I set the photograph gently back in his tunic pocket and folded his cold hands over his chest. He had a mother somewhere. So did Pavel. Night fell over Stalingrad. The lower floors of the silo were fully engulfed in flames, the concrete walls glowing red in the dark. The entire building was a tower of fire. There were no more orders to execute, no more lines to hold, and no more ammunition to load. The remaining handful of guardsmen gathered by the broken windows of the second floor. Outside, the thick autumn fog was rolling off the Volga, wrapping the city in a cold white shroud. We tied our leather rifle straps together and dropped them over the stone windowsills into the gloom below. I helped Boris over the stone ledge first, pushing the heavy sailor into the dark. He looked back at me without a word, his knuckles cracking in silence, then slid down into the fog. I turned back one last time toward the interior of the silo, where Pavel lay near the grain chute, buried under the quiet flour dust. Then I jumped into the night. We hit the soft embankment of fallen rubble below and scrambled through the darkness on our hands and knees. As we crawled through the ruined timber yard, a German flare popped high overhead, bathing the snow-dusted ground in a harsh, chemical white glare. We froze flat against the frozen mud, pressing our faces into the rubble. 20 paces away, a German patrol passed in silence, their boots crunching on the icy gravel. Boris shifted, his boot scraping against a piece of corrugated iron with a loud clatter. My heart stopped. I grabbed his collar, holding him down until the German footsteps faded into the darkness. When the flare burned out, we slipped through the gap in the wire and reached the muddy banks of the Volga. A Soviet wooden supply cutter was pulling away from the stone jetty under mortar fire. I dragged Boris toward the water, shouting to the coxswain, and pulled him over the wooden gunwale just as the boat pushed out into the deep channel. The cutter slipped into the dark current of the Volga, carrying us across the water to the eastern shore. Decades have passed since that terrible September. The war ended, the armies marched away, and the ruined elevator was rebuilt from concrete and steel. The city changed its name, the bullet-scarred walls were replaced with smooth plaster, and ships once again load bulk wheat along the Volga docks. But the sound of that place never truly left my mind. Today, I sit in my quiet woodshop in Saratov, beside the open window. Outside, the summer wind moves softly through the vast wheat fields along the Volga, making the golden stalks sway like river waves under a peaceful blue sky. On the wooden sill next to me rests my old civil brass grain trier, its metal worn smooth by 40 years of work. Beside it sits my tarnished Red Army service badge, dark with age. Boris lived out his days down in Sevastopol, never hearing another word or another song, his world forever silenced by the blast of the long gun. And Pavel remains 18 years old, resting under the foundation of the concrete tower by the Volga. Iron and concrete can crumble into dust, but the memory of those boys never fades. Whenever I look out at the grain harvests of Saratov, I do not see flour or bread. I see the soft wool scarf, the brass token, and the silent young men who gave everything to hold the line. If you believe men like Pavel should not disappear from history, leave a sign of respect by subscribing to the channel. We tell these stories so they are never forgotten.